Then there's California. That's the name of this podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that, even in the midst of a pandemic, make California exceptional. I'm Brian Green. The state capitol building where I am right now, an otherwise bustling civic hub on an April weekday, is quiet and closed, as the legislature's not planning to meet again in formal session until early May, for obvious reasons. But social distancing, emptiness, and absence contradict the very concept of governing and legislating. Constituents want services and connection with their elected officials, and government must keep moving in order to serve and protect its people. And the 120 members of the California legislature are doing their part right now in cooperation with the governor, at a distance from the Capitol, but in fact at home in their districts, partnering with local leaders in their communities, providing services and assurances of government continuity to those constituents, and trying to determine how to keep the wheels of the state turning, while far removed physically from their Capitol offices and lawmaker colleagues. On this edition of Then There's California, we will talk about the challenge of governing a quarantined California, how state legislators are balancing their constitutional duties with their own personal adjustments, how California's state government is preparing long-term to deal with the expected changes in its economic and human landscape, and maybe even how a crisis like this can reshuffle the deck that we call living in California, perhaps creating an opportunity in its wake for meaningful social progression and change. State Senator Bill Monning represents the coastal and inland regions in California's 17th Senate District, Central California. A former state assemblyman as well, Senator Monning's legislative platform has been focused on the holistic health of the human body and our environment. Senator Monning has walked many paths with a lot of diverse communities in this state, and we appreciate his combo of hindsight, insight, and foresight. And Senator Monning joins us by phone from his home in his district. Senator Monning, welcome back to Then There's California.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, and just want to thank you and your colleagues for helping maintain this connective tissue between members and constituents and keeping these conversations going, perhaps more important now than ever before.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you taking the time. How are you doing? Let's start with the basic questions. How are you coping with all of this?
Well, thank you for asking. My wife and I and our family, we're all doing fine, and we're observing the sheltering in place and doing some walks from our home to get our exercise. But other than that, really trying to honor the governor's and the CDC's strong recommendations and requirements to the best defense against this virus is isolation. It makes doing the work that much harder, but offices are continuing to provide constituent services, and I've been very busy at home working the phones virtually all day, every day.
How are you balancing your own health and safety limitations and precautions with, I'm sure, a compulsion, and I guess you could say a constitutional obligation to maintain some sort of stability in your district?
Well, both a constitutional obligation and probably part of my constitution as well. My wife and I have tried to develop a little bit of a schedule in terms of protecting time for exercise and reading time and not watching 24/7 news coverage of data and statistics from around the country and around the world.
Oh, that is stress-inducing for sure.
So I do think for all people sheltering in place, using it to improve the household and improve communication with family and maintaining levity, sense of humor, but also staying informed. And in our neighborhood, we've done outreach to local neighbors, some elderly, and making sure they're okay and getting what they need. But again, the unpredictability of the needs of my district has made it hard to stick to any real schedule because incoming concerns from the 21 cities I represent and the 4 counties, Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Luis Obispo counties, each day presents new challenges of impacted constituents in the district. So we're doing our best to provide current information and individual lifelines for people who need immediate help.
Your district demographics are very diverse. You have beautiful coastal mansions and tourist destinations. I mean, how lucky a guy can be to have Hearst Castle in his district. The beautiful wineries of Paso Robles and Atascadero. But there's also the fields and the harvests of counties filled with farm workers. So there's a lot of different economies and needs. There's hotel owners. There's housekeepers. How are they faring? Share some of the perspectives of what's going on in the 17th district.
Yeah, well, you describe well the diverse demographics of this beautiful coastal and inland district, and we have among some of the highest educated and wealthiest Californians living in the coastal areas, and then we have about 26% living in poverty or abject poverty. The two biggest employers in my district, one is agriculture, and that work is deemed essential, and the second largest employer is hospitality tourism. And we'll start with that. That industry has taken an immediate overnight hit of closed restaurants, hotels, banquet services, etc. We've had thousands of workers go from an overnight decision to close to no paycheck. And so that represents literally thousands of constituents, many of them immigrant, low-income, hourly wage workers who work paycheck to paycheck and right now aren't getting those paychecks. And then on the lateral plane, I guess, is immigrant farm workers deemed essential, still going to work and serving our entire nation by cultivating and harvesting essential food products, but not necessarily benefiting from the protections that others are being told to observe. They're not able to shelter in place. By definition, their work involves carpooling to workplaces, riding on company buses and labor contractor buses to work, working shoulder to shoulder in fields, on harvest machines, or in processing plants where the salads are produced, long hours, shoulder to shoulder, without necessarily support for child care for children that are home from school, without support for even unemployment benefits, without protection for older farm workers. So a lot of my work with members of our Democratic caucus in the Senate and other colleagues focused on trying to make sure these workers deemed essential aren't left by the wayside when it comes to being mindful of the health risks they face. And one thing we know, Brian, the coronavirus, it doesn't discriminate based on immigration status, on wealth status, on poverty status. It's an equal employer infector. Perhaps the only class divide is that those that are wealthier are more able to shelter in place and have their basic needs taken care of, whereas the low-income immigrant worker, their paycheck is at the job site. And so they are going to go to that job site at risk to themselves and potentially at risk to their families. So that's been a big focus of our work for farm workers and for low-income hospitality workers.
I know one challenge of this, too, that knows no economic divide really is the mental health challenge. We don't talk about that a lot, but people who perhaps are sitting on their mansions on the coast and are forced to socially distance and stay confined are dealing with mental health issues just as someone who is working the fields every day and worried about the fate of their health and their families on a 24-hour basis.
I'm glad you raised that, Brian, because one reference point I'll just mention right up front is on my Senate website. We have a link to coronavirus resources. There are some specific links for mental health support. As part of our health infrastructure, even in the best of times, we have limited mental health resources. Often insurance plans don't provide full support for mental health services. The stigmas attached with it. But in times of crisis, when stress is the greatest, that's when the mental health barometer goes up. In our district offices, and we do try to direct people to those services that are up and running, that are available, something as simple as a helpline that somebody can call and talk to somebody who can listen to them
Indeed.
And make appropriate referrals and references to deal with their particular concerns or problems.
Your district, as I reflect on it, is no stranger to natural disasters, floods and fires, and even, tragically, some human-caused carnage over the last year or so. But I sense there's probably some resiliency in your district within the communities as well that perhaps can help them get through something like this. Do you see that too?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And as you point out, we've suffered from massive fires, massive displacement, followed by floods and closed roads and highways and byways affecting businesses. But I do think there's a built-in resilience there. We have communication networks. We have community-based groups, volunteers that look out for each other, volunteer fire department in Big Sur that's responsive and checks in on people, does welfare checks on people just as in the normal course of business. That said, we're also seeing some real heroism with our first responders, from law enforcement to ambulance services. Our hospitals are all gearing up and converting to both be able to accept people that might be infected by the coronavirus, protecting other patients, first and foremost trying to protect staff. We have a doctor and medical society in our area up in Santa Cruz who are spearheading an effort for decentralizing the manufacture of protective masks, both for use by health workers but also for use by the public. It both protects against the spread of the virus. It's also now seen to be symbolic of people being mindful of the risk we face, and it sends a signal of the need to socially distance when you're in a public place like a supermarket or a pharmacy. The mask provides both protection, maybe less so from the person wearing it than making sure the person wearing it, if infected, does not spread infectious disease to somebody in their airspace.
Let's talk about the legislature and what's ahead here, whether in Sacramento or not in Sacramento in 2020. You mentioned communicating and caucusing with your colleagues. What are some of the stories you're hearing from your fellow senators up and down the state as we social distance and go into this triage and manage this virus?
Well, it's a great question, Brian. We are staying in regular contact virtually daily by email and text, and then weekly by conference call. Our Senate President Pro Tem, Tony Atkins, has made a really wonderful effort and succeeded in keeping all of us aware, members of both caucuses, of communications with the governor's office. And there's been a real good bilateral exchange to feed issues from our districts through the Pro Tem and directly to the governor's office, to the Office of Emergency Services, Health and Human Services, Department of Public Health. We've developed our own relationships with those agencies and directors, and then also as a caucus we've done it. So we're sharing resources that can be shared with our constituents, but as you suggest, members also are sharing issues that might be unique to their district based on geography, based on industry, based on highways, rural versus urban. One of the issues we've all shared in common is multiple inquiries about the on-ramp to unemployment insurance benefits, with the economic package from Congress, the federal stimulus, a broader swath of eligibility for unemployment insurance, including some that were not considered employees eligible for UI benefits. Now, as we call it, the gig economy, certain people that have worked as independent contractors may also be eligible for unemployment insurance benefits. And a shout out to our EDD. I know their phone lines have been jammed, their computer lines, but they are converting applications to checks out the door, and they're trying to maintain the same turnaround time under normal times, but the requests, the applications have gone up. They've quadrupled in recent days in the last couple weeks. But a shout out to those state workers who are trying to observe social distancing in the workplace, but still increasing staff levels to help constituents. I'd say that's been the number one issue.
Well, once again, your response brings up another thought, too. You and your colleagues started off 2020 with a legislative agenda, a new state budget plan from the governor, and what was, just even a few months ago, a strong economy. And the economic and legislative landscape looks nothing like it did at the new year, much less a week ago. So what does legislating mean in a pandemic for this fourth largest economy in the world? You've mentioned unemployment response and relief. Are there some other legislative issues? And we won't hold you to any plans that are in the work right now, but any policies or proposals that you or your fellow senators are considering now that you think will help ease the transitions for the communities and business and healthcare?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So there's a lot going on, but as you suggest, I think it's pretty clear to everybody that we're in new terrain. The budget introduced by the governor in January, by public statements from the Department of Finance, it's going to be contracted to a kind of hold in place, trying to maintain current budgeting levels. But even that's going to be under jeopardy. All of the main engines of our revenue to the state are currently jeopardized, if not paralyzed. As we stand in recess, we maintain regular contact with our budget committees. We were last in Sacramento to vote emergency budget allocations on March 16th, I believe it was.
Which seems like an eternity ago.
It does. And even then, members had been ordered to shelter in place if over the age of 60. We did show up in Sacramento to achieve our quorums and to do what we do strongly believe was the essential work of the legislature, to vote emergency funding to step up our healthcare infrastructure in the state, including reopening closed hospitals, expanding medical services throughout the state of all types. We also passed emergency legislation to keep funding for our public schools in place and flowing, even though students are no longer in school. Those two emergency votes kept the money flowing to schools so they can continue to try to teach children who are at home, pay their monthly bills, and gear up for adapting to the coronavirus. So those were essential votes, and I was proud that I could be part of that, and again, proud of our leadership and the bipartisan support for passing both of those emergency budget bills. But we will return to a very different budget landscape, and
yes.
My fear is that we will face some serious reductions in state revenues that will translate into reductions in budgeting for everything from public education to higher education to healthcare services, everything across the board as we faced in 2008, 2009. My guess is everything will be on the table. That said, through former Governor Brown and Governor Newsom, and I believe our legislative majorities, we've put in place a strong reserve, and we'll see how that can help bridge some of the gaps we face in the short term. It's also my hope that our economy will strongly rebound once we're ahead of the virus or the virus is behind us and people are able to restore business activities and get those engines of business and our economy up and running again. I just think we have to be cautious not to jump the gun. We have to be prudent and follow the leadership of medical experts, and our political leaders, myself included, should be informed first and foremost by the medical experts. And when we return, I think it's fair to say budget is going to be first and foremost. We have a June 15th constitutional deadline for both houses to pass a unified budget to send back to the governor for his review and signature by the end of the month of June. My guess is that that may forestall work on some other issues, but we will still be very mindful of some of our other ongoing priorities of housing and homelessness, wildfire prevention and response. Some of these also constitute ongoing public health priorities that will not be put by the wayside or abandoned. They're part and parcel of how we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic that is affecting us right now, but we are in a position to plan, we're in a position to prepare, and we're in a position to rebound thoughtfully, smartly, and with focused action as we return to work, hopefully in May, but whenever we're cleared to do so.
Senator, after nearly 12 years in the California legislature, 2020 is your last year in office. You're termed out at the end of this year. And I know that a pandemic scenario was not on your agenda or in your planning books for your final year as a lawmaker. And candidly, a soft drink warning label bill signed into law would be the wonderful thing for California for you to be able to end your legislative career on. That may not happen. How are you reconciling the new priorities here of California with what you wanted to do in your last year?
Well, I think you raise a very legitimate question, but for me, it doesn't pose that big of a personal crisis. Our call is to respond to this pandemic first and foremost. So other individual legislation that does not directly relate to the public health is probably not going to be priority work for me in my final year. I've been very fortunate, Brian, in having a wonderful run in, as you say, in my 12th year in the legislature, my 8th year in the Senate. Last year we were able to pass a huge public health measure on safe, clean drinking water that will generate about $1.3 billion to remedy water systems around the state of California. To me, that's a measurable achievement. It wasn't done alone. It was done with a broad coalition of supporters and a great staff. None of us achieve anything on our own. In terms of this year's priorities, I will have to review our current list. Some are public health measures. Some do relate to ongoing district issues, issues related to wildfire prevention and protection, issues related to our continued water issues. So where there's a public health common denominator, if you will, those are the types of issues that can link to how we emerge from the pandemic. But I will work to the final day of my term, and I will work with my colleagues in our Senate leadership and Assembly leadership and the governor's office to put my energies and my experience in the areas that can most immediately help my district and all Californians as we confront the pandemic and as we hopefully emerge soon from the adverse human health and economic impacts of the pandemic. So I'll sprint to the finish line. As you said, not exactly how I thought my last legislative session might go.
Sure.
But I do look forward and hope that we will be able to return sooner rather than later to Sacramento and roll up our sleeves and do the work of the people of the state of California.
Well, I appreciate your generous attitude on behalf of California. I want to talk about the heroes also, working in our communities, working at our hospitals, working in our ERs and ICUs. And I guess particularly for you in Central California in your district, we're hearing a lot from the front lines all over the globe of how the medical professionals are dealing with this and their own personal stories. I've heard stories of some ER and ICU physicians having to draw up their wills or having discussions about who should care for their children if they should succumb to this virus, or talking with their spouses about who their spouses should marry if something happens to them. I cannot fathom having these kind of discussions with a loved one or with family, or keeping this so front of mind as you're dealing with your daily life. So keeping all that in mind, what are some of the conversations and discussions or feedback that you're getting from the medical professionals in your community?
Well, it mirrors much of what you've said, Brian, and these are conditions that face many of these frontline workers every day, pandemic or not, and maybe a reminder to all of us that to have the tough conversations with family members about advanced medical directives, about estate planning, and taking the burden off children by not doing some of that planning in advance. I have also heard of medical workers fashioning handwritten wills and talking with loved ones. We've heard of doctors coming home from shifts, trying to decontaminate, leaving work clothes at work, showering before they get home, but still sleeping in separate rooms to protect spouses and children. That's going to continue in the short term. But I think first responder or not, frontline worker or not, all families might use some of this sheltering in place time to make sure they understand the wishes of elders in the family about end-of-life decisions and decision-making. And there's no better time than the present to have those tough conversations, but realize that it's ultimately an act of love for loved ones to know what your preferences are and to do the planning that can make the aftermath of a loss easier for surviving loved ones. You know, in the direct face of COVID-19 and the pandemic, we hear so much talk about ventilators and the shortage of ventilators and the need to mobilize ventilators. Well, I think it's important here maybe just to remind listeners, once you're on a ventilator, that is a last-ditch effort. And somewhere between 60 to 80% of people put on a ventilator do not survive. So a ventilator is not a saving device. It is a saving device for a very small percentage of people. For most people, it represents the end of the line. So being proactive and preventive in our approach, don't expect the ventilator is going to save your life. It's the social distancing. It's observing and abiding by the best recommendations from our public health officers of sheltering in place, and if you have to go out, maintaining 6 feet of distance, now wearing masks, even if it's a handkerchief when you're at a market or a pharmacy. That's your best investment in your future. Ventilators are important. They can save lives, but they're also not the best public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you for that information, and beautifully put. We keep talking here in California, and I'm sure across the country, about when we come back to normal. Oh, we just cannot wait to come back to normal. And I sense that the all clear and the back to normal, when we finally get that, will be in stages, not all at once. For instance, maybe we can go back to church, but let's not go back to rock festivals. And the way I like to put it is, if we do it too quickly, it's like somebody fasting for a month and then all of a sudden they have a 4-hamburger meal. Just not really the best way to transition. So what do you think normal will be for California when this ends? And how is it going to affect our identity? Are we going to be a different kind of state?
Well, it's a great question. And again, I think it's going to revolve to what do the public health experts recommend. As there's a return to normal, it will probably come with ongoing recommendations of social distancing, avoiding large crowds, etc. I'm not the public health expert, but we will do everything we can to share that information. The return to normal may be a staged return, as you suggest. One of my hopes, maybe on the more philosophical side, is that all are going to be starved of social contact. We're missing that social contact.
Absolutely.
But we're also being innovative. We see people using different forms of media connection and conferencing. We see people reaching out to people with a simple phone call or a FaceTime chat with family members that maybe don't live close to each other and don't routinely have the opportunity to get together. So my hope is that people will see our social connections as precious, the need to build upon them, and that we can build social networks even if we observe physical distancing in the short term, or even as required in the longer term. Physical distancing should not mean social network distancing. We need each other. We need to build stronger rapport and relationships with our neighbors, with our families, with our communities. And to me, that's the prescription for recovery, is strengthening social contacts while observing what public health experts advise in terms of physical distancing.
Just a final thought, Senator. There is a phrase in Hebrew that I ran across recently, and hopefully I'm saying it correctly, Gam zu il tova, which means this too shall be for the good. Mm-hmm. So considering everything that you have just said, there's going to be a lot of scar tissue for California coming out of this. What is the good that can come out of this pandemic and everything we have been through? Well,
again, to do the work I do, and maybe it's a genetic defect, I hope not, optimism has to be a guiding force.
I want that genetic defect.
Yeah. And even in the face of very dire consequences right now of the pandemic, as somebody who looks to the future, my hope is that this is a pandemic. By definition, it's infecting people in virtually every country on the globe. And while our response is local and it's state and it's national, we are sharing in a crisis that, in my view, could replicate a pending crisis caused by the climate crisis that will have profound environmental and public health impacts. And that if we want to look at a bright side of how we're dealing with the pandemic, it may be appropriate to look at it as a dress rehearsal of how do we learn from this, how do we better prepare our public health infrastructure, how do we better work with each other as neighbors, as co-inhabitants of this ever-shrinking planet Earth. And these divides that are political and philosophical and cultural, we need to overcome those divides to recognize our shared and common humanity. And one thing that emerges in crisis is always the stories of heroism. We hear of those who opportunistically, con artists who will try to play upon people, and I would caution people through this podcast to be careful of those offering to expedite payment of your federal check and asking for your Social Security number in a phone call. Don't share it. Be skeptical.
Good point.
Be wise. But on the flip side of that spectrum of people who take advantage of people in times of crisis, we're hearing hundreds of stories of people stepping up, even sheltering in place, sharing wisdom, sharing humor, sharing ideas of how to help neighbors, how to better communicate with neighbors, how to make protective masks at home. And so we see the industry and the enterprise of Californians, of Americans, of people around the globe. We can continue to learn from each other and build a foundation coming out of the pandemic that we may need to do to protect our fragile planet with what I believe and scientists believe is not a coming climate crisis, it's an existing climate crisis, and it's up to us to try to minimize the public health impacts of that. So let's draw from these experiences to strengthen our public health infrastructure and to build upon our humanism of learning how to connect with neighbors, even if they don't always agree. We have some neighbors down the street who have a Trump sticker on their mailbox, and in some of our past disasters and power outages, I've made a point of reaching out and just seeing how they're doing as people, trying to avoid political conversation, but realizing that we're in the same neighborhood and we're both without power. So how do we cope? How do we share our resources with each other? So ever the optimist, I would hope the pandemic brings our small human family closer together, and whether it's history, culture, religion, philosophy, healthcare, medicine, we live in a continuum. And just as there won't be a day when COVID-19 is declared gone, it will be part of that continuum. We don't have to wait for the declaration of the end of the pandemic to start building the social connections that Hebrew saying call upon us to do. Let's make sure that what we do now in the middle of the pandemic is helping us work for the greater good, build for the future good. Again, I strongly believe some of the responses and habits we develop during these periods of sheltering at home, maintaining physical distancing, can also be part of laying a foundation for strengthening relationships, trying to minimize partisan divides, and join hands in working for the greater good, joining hands figuratively during social distancing, and we will look forward to joining hands physically as approved by public health experts. But as we wrap up, Brian, I mentioned some of the constituent work we're doing. I just also want to give another shout out for my staff, both those who continue to work in Sacramento and those in my district offices, working remotely from home, but fielding calls from our offices, having those calls forwarded, helping constituents with unemployment insurance benefit applications, other immediate, some unique problems, some shared problems with other constituents. But our offices continue to be on the front lines of the response, and I would include our staff among those deemed essential workers because they're continuing to work long days and under trying working circumstances or environments, but we're figuring out how to make it work. And I just want to acknowledge the work not only of my staff, but of colleagues, legislative colleagues, and their staffs around the state.
Thank you for saying that. On behalf of all of the staff, we appreciate that support. Senator, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm grateful to you. I wish you and your family and the good people of the 17th Senate District continued good health and peace of mind. And I'm grateful for your insight and honesty in this conversation, and I really do hope to see you back in Sacramento sooner than later.
Thank you so much, Brian, and shout out to all of your team and those of you who may listen to this. Hope you'll let us know your thoughts and offer your contributions for how you're navigating the current pandemic. Thanks so much.
Couldn't have said it better myself. State Senator Bill Monning of California's 17th Senate District, the Central Coast and Valley. And that is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. It's a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Sabiniano, Gunjan Patel, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of Senator Bill Monning of the 17th Senate District, I'm Brian Green. Stay healthy and secure, everybody. From the state capitol in Sacramento, thanks for listening to Then There's California.